Welcome back to Brothers in Boots. My name is Mike, and today we're going to be doing a continuation of our Kreosote series. We are going to go through with some video that Gabbard himself gave me, going over last interpretation, design, patterns, and how the entire process works of taking a client's foot measurements, putting them on a last, and how the differences in that last design affect the foot, the build-up, and the different pieces that go into it. So I'm going to start with an intro from Gabbard, and we're going to go from there. I hope you guys enjoy.
Hey, this is Gabbard from Kreosote Boots, and I had the pleasure of hosting Michael R. Smith from BiB, which is Brothers in Boots, a few days ago here at the shop. And one of the topics of conversation that we had were last development and design interpretation, mathematical calculations of foot measurements from clients transferred onto a last. And we had a small technical glitch in our recordings, and I told Mike I'd come back and provide a little more insight into what it was that we started off with. So I hope you all enjoy this. I know that the BiB conversations in the past have been filled with really good technical information, and it's nice that they were interested to want to talk to me about my process. So I hope you enjoy this. Cheers. From the foot, we develop a last, and from the last, we develop a series of patterns, and from those patterns, we choose and pick a series of techniques or applications to leather. So that it kind of goes backwards before it goes forward, unless you're just copying a pattern or a design, and then that's a whole different usage of commercialism. So made to measure is somewhat different than RTW and made to order because of the process, and because of the process that the particular shoemaker or designer, artist would choose to find a relationship with. So I have chosen the relationship of design, mainly inspired by architectural shapes. And so before I was able to make something like this, I needed to understand dimensional relationship of 2 before you can go to 3, which is understanding the foot measurements, and then being able to look at a piece of paper and create an abstract drawing on a piece of paper that possibly would leave you with some sort of pattern shape, what you'd like to do with a particular last, right? So before you get to this stage, you need to take a block of wood and transfer your ideas about the shape and the dimensions based on your foot measurements. And so I use my own foot. I have a very, what you would call a common standard 10D, 10E, size foot. So easy to get on a nice block of wood. Easy to transfer ideas based on size ratio.
In this section, Gabbard's talking about a couple of very specific things that I want to clarify just for those that aren't as familiar with this process as he is. So what he's talking about here is when he talks about taking the measurements and putting them on a block of wood, that's a portion of the process. When he's talking about taking dimensions from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, he's talking about starting with like a silhouette that's like a boot drawing, right? It's like an idea that you would put down on a piece of paper of what you want your boot to look like. And from that like side picture, you see this a lot in like bespoke cowboy boots where they'll draw like a picture of like what your upper stitching pattern looks like before they do the actual drawing where they poke the holes in it. And you take that, you get that idea, that kind of silhouette, the pieces that you're looking for, and then you take your foot measurements and apply that to the block of the wood, like the piece of the parlor scaw he's got here in the picture, of the different angles and sizes to get the last that will create the shape that he's looking for. Now, that's important to know because he's starting with a drawing that's boot-esque or a boot idea, translating that into a rough lath shape. That's the measurements he's talking about, is a rough lath shape. Applying the measurements of his foot to the block of wood, cutting that block of wood out. And he's going to talk about this a little bit later. Once he has that block of wood, he's going to tape that last off, cut that tape off into pieces to make what is essentially the master template. And that is taking that boot idea, that concept, putting the mathematical measurements of your foot, in this case his foot, against it, and then creating the last. That's where he's talking about you have to get to the last and then kind of start over, because you're starting with a picture of like what it should look like, putting it into just a side drawing, essentially, not even a mathematically accurate side drawing, translating that shape into a last shape with your measurements, carving that last out, and then working your way back to a pattern that then becomes the boot. Hopefully that clarifies what he's talking about when he means going from 2D to the mathematical lines and intersections to 3D, which is the last itself, which will lead to a pattern. And he'll get into the specifics of getting to that pattern here later.
To take the measurements from and transfer onto a piece of paper that has an idea of shape and design and pattern, but yet it doesn't have a fluid element to tie it all together yet, because it's just an idea. And so once you take that idea from the measurements, put it on a piece of paper, you take a block of wood and you put your markings on the block of wood, your mathematical calculations, and you create a standard. And from that point of cutting out the wood, you end up having a last based on some ideas that we've talked about. But I could never have gotten to that point or to this point now. Here's a last that I'm developing. And I'm still in probably, I'd say 85% of this last is finished. You know, in my mind, it has the nice walled toe with a nice rail. The cuneiform, bone on my foot is right where it should be on the last. The heel counter, for me, the backstay area of a boot is very important as it runs up the Achilles. So the clip of the heel where your foot drops into the boot and is kind of locked into the boot is at a good place mathematically, shape-wise. The cone and the relationship between the cone and the clip are getting there. Again, for me, contour lines on the medial and lateral side at the waist are very important. I've been highly influenced by European cordwainer techniques that draw that waist in.
Two really important callouts here that I think are quite understated is when he's talking about the clip and the narrowing of the waist. These are two things we don't see a lot in the heritage community that have a very important place. If you have seen like European dress shoes, you'll see this concept he's talking about a lot. But usually in heritage boots, we'll see something that's a little bit more of what we describe as a floating heel, an area where your heel does not make the same contact with everything around you. Your heel's kind of in a floating state where it's the uppers above it that help hold it in place. The concept he's talking about here of a clip is something that's very prevalent in European shoemaking, where the clip is above your kind of the fatty parts of your heel, the parts where we get stuff like bone spurs and whatnot, just before the ankle bone, where the Achilles is making the transition to the ankle. It is holding it around the Achilles and the two shelves that exist around your heel. And that clip is a very different feeling from like a floating heel, in that it locks your heel in place without needing assistance from your cuneiform area, which is your instep to waist, to hold your foot in place. and it gives just a very different feeling from that aspect. It's a very different way of solving the problem versus what a lot of us are used to with kind of more the American style floating heel. And that also leads into where it allows them to narrow the waist, because with that waist narrowing, not only does it cup under your foot more and kind of give you some of the arch support that we're used to feeling in the P&W world from added leather layers, the narrow waist tucks the uppers under that really kind of helps support the arch in that medial and lateral side of your foot that is, instead of done exclusively in the bottoming, the upper in the pattern is helping with that fit and design to kind of give you a more balanced silhouette, but not just balanced. It fits in a way that'd be very different from like a P&W boot. Even if P&W could do the full made-to-measure process he's talking about here, it's a very different style of fitting. Even from the previous video, if you've watched it, where we talk about the toe links, he gives a much closer to an inch or a little over an inch in front of your toe, where the P&W guys are usually 5/8 to 3/4. So that entire process is quite a bit different. And with that clip and that narrow waist, it allows a nicer sweep and just a little bit more control over different processes in the boot, especially in terms of fitment and the buildup, than you would get from kind of what we see traditionally in heritage style footwear, which is that floating heel. But it's a stylistic thing, right? And this is how he's achieving a much more balanced silhouette in terms of, for lack of a better word, removing the chunk. You're keeping the chunky designs out of the boot.
Before I was able to get here, carve out of a block of wood and make a last, I had to study last. And of course, getting back to that conversation about eras, what eras will inspire you over other eras, the eras of a service style boot, a military officer boot, a military officer riding boot. So I kind of moved in between 1840 and then stopped around 1920, and then got really involved in studying last designs from the 20s up to the 40s. And we've all been, interested in a Munson last. So this is a Munson last, and there were several last houses that designed the Munson last. Krentler Brothers. This is the Krentler Brothers from 48. It has a wonderful sweep, as you can see. It has a bump toe. This is called a bump toe. This is not a walled toe. This is a bump toe for obvious reasons. You can see that, the metatarsals and the development of the joint area were very important when this was developed. So the toe was pronounced, and it gave you the right amount of room. You can see that the toe is large at the toe and sweeps, the contour sweeps down, to the joint on the lateral side. So it's just a very nice soft line. This is a Munson. The iteration of the Munson then turned into a walled toe. And this is a 1943 officer's walled toe. Again, you can see the nice sweep that the ball area has from the throat or the instep, and it doesn't have a large bump. It's a little bit just slightly softer, smoother. The line stops long before the ball, so it kind of has a nice soft contour to it. A nice last. I found this last years ago, and I studied these lasts, and then I got a block of wood, and I took my foot measurements, and I came up with the nail shank last, which incorporated a nice sweep. Again, I favor a walled toe, but my walled toe, as you can see, the rail of the walled toe doesn't fall short on the lateral side before it gets to the joint. It rides a nice little edge line until just before the ball. and then sweeps downward on both sides. And that, that's a personal preference of design, carving, and what you're capable of at the time, right? So I did this back in 2018, started working on that. If you look at these two last, you'll see it's quite different. This is at 30 and that's at 25 millimeters. And the rail is very different on the new last because the wall toe, the wall, it doesn't stop, just before the ball. It continues beyond the ball, beyond the first joint. It continues backwards and has what I would call a rail. It has a strong rail before it sweeps inward into the waist of the last. And you can tell the instep at the vamp point, much different. So as you are working on, if you're a shoemaker, and so you want to make your own lasts, to teach yourself how to carve your own last, make your own last out of wood is not so easy. But the rewards of that allow you to see transitional growth in your development as a maker, as a boot maker, in more of a traditional cordwainer and traditional sense. So back in the day, a cordwainer would, have an idea about a measurement from a foot. He would, make the last out of a block of wood in shop. He would then, transfer all those mathematical calculations from the foot to a last, and he would have a last. It's like, ta-da, here's my last. This is this boot design that I'm going to show. And if he wanted to replicate that, he would then go through a process of grading. I will show you in the next clip. I use a proportional grading method, which is called the Paris point, or otherwise known as the Euro, and it takes increments of 6.66 millimeters per size ratio and length. And because I understand that, because I grade my own templates, I make my own lasts, I've been able to work through design, inspiration, and theory, and then take the math and crunch that to create proportionally what I like to see from my work, critique my work heavily. I see profile, identity of a Kreosote boot to me is very important. So you get there by understanding how to take your ideas and transfer those onto paper, and then take your foot measurements and then, mash up the calculations and make a last, and then you come up with a template pattern. So from here, the next part of the process would be that I would tape off the last, and I would have my intersecting lines, and I would come up with a pattern. And then when you have the pattern, you then go a step further where you lay that out on a piece of paper, and it's a bit wrinkly and bumpy and it's not accurate because you're using a pencil and it's on a three-dimensional form, and so you need to really clean up those lines and find out if those intersecting points, between the short heel and the long heel and the vamp, and your center point, counterpoint, the standard length of the last, it jives. A placement of where your breast of heel is in relationship to your counter, pattern design, a lot of things to think of and a lot of things to trial and error through. But after, some time, you'll get better at that, and you'll be able to come up with patterns quicker. And the quicker you are in your eyes mindset of taking an idea to from a 2D to a 3D, you'll kind of get into a groove with it, and you'll be happy with um, doing something really different and really abstract.
One really big call out here is when he talks about grading his own patterns, this gives him significantly more freedom than one would think off the top. So when he talks about the standard size for the Paris point or the Euro grading method, also known as proportional grading, being 6.66, and I've even seen others like call it like 6.67 for easier math. What that means is when you go from a 10 to an 11, you're increasing the overall proportion of your template, which would be your last in this case, by 6.66 millimeters, right? But if you're creating your lasts and grading your own patterns, which means you're effectively, defining what the length is in the proportion full size to full size, you could cut that in half. So now your sizes could be 3 millimeters or 3.33 millimeters would technically be half, right? And now when you go from a 10 to 11 in the traditional sense of what you see with a lot of factory lasts of 6.66, that difference is going from 10 to 11 to 6.66. But if you make the last yourself, grade the patterns yourself, going up that 6.66 would actually be going from a 10 to a 12 now. The way you do the scaling between sizes becomes up to you. Now, while that's a pain for us consumers in terms of figuring out what our correct size is, this is made to measure, so that doesn't have a lot of relevance here. But for ready-to-wear footwear, that's problematic. But it gives Gabbard and any other made-to-measure maker that does their own lasts the ability to proportionally define the silhouette up and down so that you get balanced shapes at all sizes. The problem that you can run into with like your standard sizing is a lot of times we notice when we see stuff in like a 4 or a 5, it looks all ankle and almost no foot. Or you pull out a 14 or a 15 and it looks almost all foot and no ankle, very clown shoe. When you do this grading yourself and you have the skills to do it, and you've worked through it enough times, and you've gained the additional skills to really hone that portion of the craft, you can start making those sizes look considerably better in those really large sizes, in those really small sizes. That granularity and control gives you the ability to really define what you were trying to create. Like a lot of times we think of lasts, especially from P&W, is just toe shapes, right? Like, oh, most of them are the same. These are just the differences in the toes. And maybe there's some toe spring, maybe there's some higher heel, lower heel, arch, no arch, so on and so forth. But most, for the more accurate representation, we think of them really more as toe shapes. What he's talking about here is quite a bit different. When he showed the nail shank last versus the last in development, and he's talking about the difference between 25 and 30, he's talking about the toe spring on the last, and how those two lasts, even though to us regular viewers look like they share a lot of similarities, the actual boot that's made out of them will be starkly different. They'll be two very different silhouettes, proportions, sizes. Like in looking at it, it's like, oh, it's got a shorter toe box, this one's got more toe springs, so on and so forth. But there's more to it than that. The entire proportion of how the boot sweeps, the taller toe spring plus the way the instep to waist to ball area transitions in that cuneiform region that he's talking about is a very graceful sweep. Whereas the nail shank is a more narrower, still graceful, but more narrower sweep from that cuneiform into the toe shape, and leaves the taller toe box that you see on it, that gives it that very defined wall toe, which has almost a kind of a point to it when it's very first lasted, when they're first worn, that a lot of people see as kind of that nail shank looking toe. Whereas the one he's developing will be a sleeker, narrower toe. So I think I mentioned this in the last video, but the nail shank and the 9 ditches share the same last. It's the only boots in his collection of the 20 models he's made over the years, or 20-ish models. I think he's probably over 20 now. He's probably like 22. Because I think the Parlor Ska was 21 and the Fiction was 22. All of them had their own last, except for the Nail Shank and the Nine Ditches. But the Nine Ditches had a companion when he released the Nine Ditches. It was called the One Undertaker. And the One Undertaker has a very similar looking pattern, but uses a very different last. So even though there's similarities between the two of them, and in the background you saw a One Undertaker, that was the burgundy boot on the shelf next to the roller skate. That was the One Undertaker. While it looks a lot like the same pattern as the Nine Ditches, it's a very different shape and silhouette. And that's what he's getting to here of, taking what you want to see, like what is aesthetically pleasing to you, and breaking it down into its final form with the last. This is the control you get over it when you make your own last. Now, as he said, this isn't probably something that you would be able to sit down and create your 5 most recognizable models in, a 1 year, 2 year span. It takes time. It takes experience. And there'll be a certain point at which you probably could create them at that speed. But if you look at the models over the years he's released them, even Gabbard himself has not, produced the same model each time. That's what he's talking about in like the value of craftsmanship and working up to your skill level is, he had one, and then he made the next one, and then he made the next one, and each one he could refine it more. He could bring his vision closer to life, and each step is a building process. That's why he talks about with his Parlor Ska, he couldn't start with the engineer, even though it's one of the first boots he wanted to build. He had to make all the boots before the Parlor Ska so that the Parlor Ska could be the Parlor Ska.
Last development is quite important, and I think if I could say anything to, I get calls from time to time, young bootmakers, shoemakers. I think to make sure that you're looking at really good works as opposed to just average works is very important. And you have to develop a discerning eye. You have to recognize better quality work. That will help you as a young bootmaker or a young shoemaker. If you're new at this, and when you are new at this, maybe a lot, you're like a moth to the light. You're attracted to that light, that glow, and maybe the hype of other people's ideas or emotional opinions to a certain style or design or make or something like that. But when you're young, you should do your best to do as much research as you can and read from very, well illustrated books and listen to, quote unquote, master bootmakers. I have studied the works of many master bootmakers, and they probably don't even like to think of themselves as master bootmakers, because everybody that I've ever worked for or listened to or been interested in their works, they're so much better than me, and I learned so much, and I was, the receptors were they're popping. I was just eating up as much as I can, and that's the key. I think if you are attracted to people that are doing works that are so much better than yours at that time, then you have a lot to aspire to, and you'll get to a point where you're making better work than you would had you been inspired by works that are average. Craftsmanship, it varies on levels, and most people, we all get there in our own time.
On the note of craftsmanship, it cannot be stated loud enough that, at least in my opinion, Kreosote boots are probably the pinnacle of American heritage boots. We talk about PMW, we talk about like these American-made boots, like excluding cowboy boots, because that's just a slightly different category. We talk about the roll clubs, the clinch, the white clouds, the Indonesian makers. I find what I think a heritage boot looks like most in Kreosote. And going from the fact that the craftsmanship is, and I'll show more examples of this later, there is just a little bit of extra put into everything Gabbard does. To kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, he's talking to specific about the last design and getting the way he looks. I am going to show some more of how the boot really gets there, but the fact that everything you get is hand dyed and treated. None of this is tannery dyed. None of this comes in a color. The fact that the first week of a boot's life, is him doing the dyeing, treating, finishing. So of the 80 hours to make a boot, the first week is just getting the leather prepped. The second week is actually doing the building parts in of itself. But the extra steps that he takes to constantly improve each step of the process, make adjustments that help make the boots better every time he makes them. And he'll flat out say some of the methods that he uses that we'll explore a little bit are things that he just thought of doing, wasn't necessarily something he picked up from somewhere. And that's what he's talking about when he means aspiring to the people who make a better product than your current skill level, and trying to constantly work and constantly get better. I can tell you that his work has gotten better over time, and it continues to get better. His techniques get better. The way he does stuff gets better. His dyes, his formulative process, all of it will continue to get better and better and better as he makes more and more boots. But it's the never settling part that really drives it home for me. His designs are balanced. They're articulate. He has clear visions for them. He talks about the discerning eye. The discerning eye is something we see in everyday life, where they're just people who can see a bunch of blotches on a wall and pick out the two that matter. And it's not a skill that you can necessarily train, but it is a skill you can hone. Like, if you don't have it, if the discerning eye never works for you, it might never work for you. But for those who can see the two important things on a wall full of junk, and then hone that, make it better, find the beauty in the flaws, and continue to drive the process, that is just not something you're going to get every day. And the designs, the lasts, and just overall the attention that's put into the process of the design is just on another level. He showed the nail shank and a nail shank like last that he's developing. They're both walled-toed lasts. We could use a lot of the same descriptors we use for multiple different brands out there, right? But even though they're both walled-toed lasts, they're both a roughly standard heel height. They have slightly different toe springs. But between those two, they're going to make a very, very different looking boot, with features that us commonly as consumers, which most of us, that watch this channel, are going to be more consumers than makers, we would use these to decide to describe the differences in a single maker's lineup, or the difference between multiple makers. Whereas in this case, these descriptors aren't descriptive enough to really differentiate the differences in his models. And that's where you're really seeing that extra power of creativity, the extra power of craftsmanship really going into full effect, especially as he can continue to develop and refine these lasts going into the future. These are just not things that we're seeing from a ton of other makers. And getting to see this in person and see all this stuff in person, one is it's a very, very gratifying experience, and I am grateful. I'm sure Gabbard will watch this at some point. I am grateful for getting to do this. It was a very selfish trip for me, and I'm trying to share as much as I feel comfortable sharing from the trip. But this is just not something you're getting other places. I've been to 3 or 4 other boot shops. I've seen what others are doing, and they're all doing great things in their own ways. This is just one of the best examples I've seen of the complete package from start to finish. No inherited patterns, no factory lasts. It's all one man's vision start to finish. And not that we'll ever see on the internet, but I guarantee you every one of these lasts and patterns he's developed had plenty of hiccups. There's probably plenty of iterations that did not make their way visible that we'll ever see before the current models were hammered down, picked out, and chosen to become models that he would sell, right? That value can't be understated, because you could brute force that. You could try a whole bunch of different variable sizes, make 6 or 7 lasts, and just pick the one that works for you. Find your 7 favorite boots, take apart from each one of them, try to make the measurements close, and emulate a style that you want to do, right? Like, that could be done. You could buy a boot off of eBay that's from the 1930s, make a last that fits the inside of it to the best of your ability, then cut that boot apart and make a pattern out of it. You could 100% do that, and then from there, either pay someone to get it graded, grade it yourself, whatever you want to do. And you could do that. That is a process that could be done. That's actually a process that's probably done more often than people think. But, one, that's not what you're getting here, and two, that's not what we should aspire for, right? Like, we should aspire to always be better than we were the last time. Do something that we couldn't do previous. Most of us in our regular jobs try to do this, but overall, generally, the average person plateaus or eventually decides that they have gone far enough and that they're good. And I don't see any signs of that here. Every model seems to be a better version of the previous, and use what worked well, didn't work well, and just general things that that Gabbard wanted to see changed in the next model or in his next vision go through properly. And these are the boots that we get. These are the boots that we order from him, and this is why people go back to him multiple times. So I wanted to leave you with a quote from him that he sent to me, and I think this is a great example of specifically what we've talked about here. But and the quote is, "Design, pattern, and craftsmanship details range in a variety of levels of quality and complexity. I like to reach beyond my grasp and then adjust my accomplishments accordingly and go again. We should never settle on limitations, but use them as progressive moves for forward-thinking accomplishments." And that is Gabbard from Kreosote Boots 2024. Please like, comment, subscribe if you like this content. I do have some more of this coming. I hope everybody's enjoying this. Any feedback, please leave down below. Any questions you have, please leave down below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. If I can't answer them, I'll see about in a later video trying to get the answers for you for what can be answered reasonably. Hope you guys all have a great evening. I hope you enjoyed this content. I know this is definitely more technical than the previous stuff. We're really getting into what would be considered, honestly, stuff you'd probably get in like an intro to, boot and shoemaking course, or as Gabbard's called it, the more European German style cordwainer. Hope you guys have a great evening, and I'll see you in the next one.